The first example I'll show you is this exploring1.html web page. Like many of the samples that I'm going to show you throughout this course, I'm using a static HTML page rather than a dynamic ASPX web page in order to make it clear that jQuery and JavaScript are doing all of the work in the client browser rather than C# or Visual Basic code on the server. This page uses a basic CSS style sheet, site.css, that you'll also see that I'll use throughout the course. It gives it a pleasant appearance, but doesn't really have anything specific to jQuery. When I need to provide a particular style for a page, I'll embed it within the page itself. That just makes it easier to look at the different samples. And then I also have a reference to version 1.5 of the jQuery library. And in this case, because this is development time, I'm using the development version. So if we wanted to step into the code, we could, and we can make sense out of it. All right, here's the body of the page. It's fairly simple. It has an H1 heading element, a couple paragraphs of text, and then a script block with some jQuery code. So the body of the page is pretty straightforward. Typical HTML that you might write with some content for a web page. The single line of code here uses jQuery, that's the jQuery function that's an entree into the jQuery library, to get a reference to all of the paragraph elements on the page and change the text. So when I run the page, you'll see that the content has this, but it's going to be changed to just say jQuery is cool. So I'll right-click on here and View in Browser, and I'm using the default Internet Explorer browser. And it displays the page, and as you can see, because of the jQuery code, it replaced all of the content for each paragraph on the page to say that jQuery is cool. All right, pretty trivial kind of an application, but it shows just how easy it is to use jQuery in order to make changes to the content on the page. Single line of code, and it changed multiple paragraphs. All right, let's look at another example that's a little bit more complex a page. Let's say that you have a set of radio buttons, and when the user clicks a button on the page, you want to get the value of the selected button and update the page in response to the selection. So before we talk about the code, I'll go ahead and show you what it does. And it displays this page. Where do you want to visit in Alaska? Anchorage, Barrow, Fairbanks, and so forth. And I can select Juneau. And I have a couple different buttons here. One that uses JavaScript, so you can see what is required in JavaScript to perform this action. And then another that uses jQuery. The effect of both buttons is the same. So when I click on JavaScript, you selected Juneau. Good choice. When I select jQuery, same thing. Displays the exact same thing. If I change to Fairbanks, it updates the text. And when I select Wasilla, it once again updates the text on the page. Okay, fairly simple and straightforward, but this actually requires a little bit of JavaScript to implement on a page. And again, keep in mind, this is all going on the client. And by the way, I love Alaska. I'm from Alaska. I'm from Fairbanks. Any place you visit in Alaska is a good choice. So that's kind of built into the application. All right, so here again is the source code for the page. I once again include the JavaScript core library. And then here's the body. Have H1 and H3 tags, some input buttons, and then I have those two buttons that use JavaScript and jQuery, and they each have different ID values. Again, pretty straightforward page, and here's my div that gets the result, the text about the user's selection. All right, now this is a little bit of a cross between JavaScript and jQuery. So I'm writing this code. This is the code that executes for that JS button. Here I'm using jQuery in order to wire up the click event function behind that particular button. But then the function, the anonymous function that executes when the user clicks the button, is straight JavaScript code. And there's a lot of different ways to do this within JavaScript. But in this particular case, it, first of all, starts by getting a reference to that set of radio buttons. And then it loops through those buttons to find out if this is the one that is checked. Once it finds the button that is checked or selected, then it assigns the value of the button to this value variable. Right, then if the value is not equal to null, which means that there is actually a selection, the code uses this getElementById in order to get a reference to that div element, this one right here, and assigns the inner HTML to you selected so-and-so, good choice. Otherwise, it gets a reference to that same result and says, please make a selection. This is the case where the user didn't make a selection of those radio buttons. So not overly complex JavaScript code, but you have to do a little bit. You have to loop through things. You have to do all the work of manipulating the DOM to get access to the checked element. So here's the jQuery code. Now I'm not going to dwell a lot on the syntax, but by the end of the course, you'll understand completely exactly what is going on within this code. So I once again use the jQuery method in order to get a reference to the button and wire up the click event function of that button. It goes out, grabs the value of the checked element. So right there you can see that in a single line of code, I've done what it took several lines of code to loop through and get that value. And then I have the same basic code in order to update the result on the page. If the value is not equal to null, then I write out that text. And I once again use this jQuery shortcut notation in order to save an awful lot of typing. So that's a very simple example of the differences between using JavaScript and jQuery to do the exact same thing on the page. So again, this JavaScript code is not rocket science, but it can be pretty tedious to write again and again, particularly if you have longish function names like getElementByName and getElementById. You'll very quickly, as we look at more and more jQuery code, see that jQuery is much more terse, much more efficient at both at development time and at runtime. Now, if you ignore some of the unnecessary line breaks, the JavaScript version of the code is about 13 and the jQuery version is about 7. jQuery gets even more amazing when you consider that the crux of each code sample, getting the value of the selected radio button, is 7 lines in JavaScript and just 1 in jQuery. That's quite a bit of difference, quite a bit of difference in typing. Now, obviously, you could get this down to a single line of code in both sample, but the point is that you're doing a lot more work in order to generate the JavaScript. And if you're like me, you're doing a lot more work just trying to figure out the way of doing something in JavaScript. There's just so many different ways of doing things. It's much more efficient in jQuery, and that's the power of jQuery. Economical, powerful, very concise code. Let's start getting into the details of the syntax of jQuery. Here's the line of jQuery code that I just showed you that made the changes to the content of the web page. Each jQuery statement consists of 4 different parts: the jQuery function, 1 or more selectors, a method, which is sometimes called an action in some contexts, and optional parameters that are needed by the action. And this statement exhibits all 4 of those parts of a statement. Here's the jQuery function. The jQuery function is the page's entree into jQuery. You'll begin every jQuery statement with this function, or its alias, which I'll get into shortly. Then the selector selects 1 or more elements on the web page that you want to take some action on. In this statement here, the selector is going to select all of the p elements on the page, no matter what ID or name they have. And this is where, if you're familiar with CSS3 selectors, you can start to recognize how jQuery is hooking into that same syntax. And then the third part is the method. The method is a JavaScript function that is defined in the jQuery library that takes some action on the selected elements, the entire group of matched set of elements. Here, the text method is going to change the text content of the selected elements. And then finally, most methods take 1 or more parameters, and many methods have several overloaded versions. The single parameter here provides the text that will replace the text in the P elements throughout the entire page. Now this jQuery statement is very simple. It's a very simple example. And as you get more adept at jQuery, your statements are likely to get far more complex, packing a lot of actions into a single statement. You can chain together multiple actions. But they'll always follow this general four-part pattern of the jQuery function, selectors, method, and parameters. Now it's time to start talking more about the jQuery function itself. As I mentioned, the jQuery function is the single point of access to the jQuery library. So you'll start all of your jQuery statements with this function. It's a very, very consistent way of accessing the library, unfortunately unlike many other libraries that you'll find out there. The function acts as a sort of namespace that exposes many other methods and functions within the library. Now, since you access all of the library features through the jQuery function, there's no chance of any naming conflicts with other libraries or your custom code. In fact, people often refer to the jQuery library as being contained in the jQuery namespace, even though JavaScript itself doesn't have direct support for namespaces. It's certainly possible to fake namespaces, as Microsoft did in its AJAX library, and they made creative use of how JavaScript defines functions. But JavaScript itself doesn't have namespaces. So for example, you could write your very own text function in custom JavaScript code in a page. To call that function, you just directly call the text function name. There's no ambiguity that you intend to call your own text function instead of the jQuery text method. And this is the beauty of having the single jQuery function access to the library. Now, you could, of course, create your own custom function and call it jQuery and use it in the same project as a jQuery library. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that, of course, but it would break your code because your browser wouldn't know which function you meant. So don't do that. But the one problem with the jQuery function is that when you begin using it a lot, it gets a bit tiring to keep typing it over and over again many times in each page. So jQuery provides an alias for the jQuery function, which is the $alias. Anytime you need to use the jQuery function, you can type $ instead. This means that these two statements are the exact equivalents. The first uses the full jQuery method. The second uses the $alias. Both of them do the exact same thing. Now, it may not seem like much to save just 5 keystrokes, and the $ on the keyboard is all the way up there at the top on the 4 key above the letters on the keyboard, so quite a stretch for the fingers. But with complex pages, it can mount to a lot of saved keystrokes. Besides, the resulting code, as you scan down a page, source code for a page, the resulting code is shorter and cleaner and saves quite a bit of bandwidth over time. So I'm going to bet that you're going to adopt and use the alias rather than the full jQuery function itself, unless you have some reason not to use the $alias. Because the one downside to using the alias is that other JavaScript libraries use $ as well, either as the main access function or as a selector alias. And this can cause a naming conflict in your code. In that kind of situation, you can opt to use only the full jQuery function name, or don't use both libraries together in your project. If worse comes to worse, you can call the jQuery.noConflict method. That's a method that's implemented and built into the jQuery library, which essentially turns off the jQuery $alias. And this is a way to allow 2 different libraries that use the $alias to coexist in the same page. But it's not something you probably are going to want or need to do very often. Now, since I'm not going to be using any other JavaScript libraries in this course, and because it produces much more concise code, for the most part, I'm going to be using the $alias throughout the rest of this course. So all of the examples are going to be using the $. One of the features that jQuery handles is the situation where you're waiting for a page to load. In both the examples that I showed you so far, the script block that wired up the click events for the buttons that changed the content of the page was at the end of the body of the web page. The reason for that placement is that all of the page elements used or referenced in the scripting code had to already be parsed and loaded into memory before the code could take any action on them. In other words, the entire DOM, the document object model, had to be instantiated before using the elements in the code. If you try to execute JavaScript on elements that aren't yet loaded into the browser, you'll either get no references when trying to access them or errors when performing the actions on them. So you have to be careful on where you place your JavaScript code. Now, there's a whole grand debate in the web development world about where in the page you should place scripts for loading and execution, and I'm going to stay away from that discussion. That's a very personal discussion, and it also depends upon the structure of the web page itself. But often, when you're using jQuery, you need to have the library loaded before executing code that uses it, and the DOM has to be ready as well. Under the unobtrusive JavaScript principle of separation of functionality, the page's code should be in the head section to keep it separated from the elements on which it acts. Now, this is kind of a gross simplification of the issue, but it will do for my purposes here. But putting it all in the head section can cause the code to run before the DOM is loaded, causing the code to fail, either silently or spectacularly. And that would have been the case in the previous examples that I showed you. Those buttons would not have been wired up properly, and when the user clicked on them, they would not have done anything. So let's take a look at the problem and how jQuery provides a very nifty solution for making sure that the page is ready for executing code. Here's ready1.html. This is the same as the exploring1.html example that I showed you just a few moments ago. Except that I've moved the script block to the top of the page, so it's up here in the header section. And I've not otherwise done anything to make sure that this code only runs when the page is ready. So I'll go ahead and right-click on this, and I'll view it in the browser. And remember in the previous example, because of that code, the text on the page in each of the paragraph elements was changed to jQuery is cool. But now that's not happening. The reason is that if I go back over to the page here, this code is executing as the page is loaded, but these elements don't yet exist in the DOM. So the jQuery function looks for all of the paragraph elements and doesn't, in this case, find any. So it has nothing to apply this change to. That code executes, and then the page continues loading, and this content then is displayed because there's no code to change it. So that's the problem with handling the ready state of the application. Now in JavaScript, you can handle this kind of a situation using this onLoad function. And in this case, you're telling JavaScript to run this anonymous function when everything is ready and loaded within the page. And I'll right-click on this and view this in the browser, and we once again get the effect that we expect. Because in this case, even though the code is located here in the header section, this delays execution until the DOM is loaded and ready to go. Now this seems all well and good, but the problem with this onLoad technique is that it delays execution until the page is fully loaded, after the DOM is fully loaded, and after the browser has retrieved all external resources, including images, embedded videos, flash animations, and everything else that you put in your wonderful creation. Not only does this mean that there could be a substantial delay before your code executes, it also means that the user is probably going to see the original content in the P elements long before the code changes it to say that jQuery is cool. And that could be a problem with certain types of content. It also affects any other actions that you take in the code, such as to wire up events for the page elements. And that's going to mean that the user could click on a button that appears, but it does nothing on the click, at least until the code that wires up the events can execute after all of the embedded YouTube videos load their initial images, or whatever it is that you're downloading. Now that effect, overall effect, probably is not the worst thing to happen, but it can appear very sloppy to users and annoy them, if they sit there and click on buttons for a few seconds until everything downloads. And the problem with annoyed users is that they usually don't stay on a site for very long. Fortunately, jQuery has a better way, and it's called the ready function. And that's what's implemented within this ready 3. So this ready function waits until the browser has parsed all of the elements in the page and loaded the DOM before executing the script you define. Now, the way you use it is pretty similar to how you use the onLoad handler, because I'm just once again defining an anonymous function that is going to execute once the DOM is fully loaded and available. All right, so same overall code. I'll go ahead and run this. And once again, we get that same effect. But the difference here between this example and the previous one, Ready 2, is that if I had a lot of other page elements, this code that changed the content would have executed much sooner. And maybe the page would still be downloading different images and so forth. Now these pages, these very simple pages, don't demonstrate that difference. But if you do load up a page with a lot of external resources, particularly external resources that have to download over a slow connection, you can see quite a dramatical difference. Now, there's one thing to point out about the syntactical difference between the onLoad and ready methods. So if I go back over here to Ready 2, you can see that I'm assigning this anonymous function to a property of this window object, this DOM object that represents the window within the browser. The syntactical difference here is that here I'm calling the ready method and passing in this function object. So I'm passing it in as the argument to this ready method or ready function. So you want to make sure that you remember to close this call with a closing parentheses here, otherwise you'll get a syntactical error. All right, so this is great. It actually works better than what's available within JavaScript. The thing about it, though, is that you're likely to use this ready method in almost all of the pages where you use jQuery, because there's almost always some sort of wiring up or some sort of animation that you need to do as part of the initial load of a page. So, in keeping with the spirit of making things simpler and more efficient in jQuery, there's a shortcut way of using this ready function. So again, the longhand version uses the $document because it's actually using this as the selector in order to get a reference to the document object and then calling this ready function on it. But the shortcut notation here in Ready 4 just uses the $sign and passes this function in as a parameter to the jQuery function itself. When jQuery sees that it's getting a function object, it knows that you want to call the ready method, and it takes care of doing that under the covers within the library itself. Now the thing is this may or may not save you a lot of typing on a particular page. You can use the ready function as often as you want within a page, and in some of the examples that you'll see in the course, you'll see that I use it 4 or 5 or 6 times. That's just because my personal preference is to do a single type of activity within each call to the ready function. But you can very easily define multiple objects, do multiple things within a single invocation of it. But either way, it's yet another way that by using jQuery, you can keep your code within the page very simple and concise and clean. Now, between the two forms, the longhand and this shorthand that I'm showing here, you can use either version you want. They do the exact same thing. Some people that I've encountered feel that the explicit call to the ready method makes the code easier to read and understand. Because when you look at this shortcut notation, even I have to kind of stop and think, okay, is that what's going on? Oh, it's calling the ready function. Okay, so that's what's happening on that page. Whereas on this other version, you can see the ready function. You explicitly know it takes a little bit less brain cycles to figure out what's going on, particularly if you're looking at a complex page with a lot of scripting code. But I tend to like the cleanness and conciseness of the page, so I tend to use the shorthand notation. One thing to keep in mind is that if you do use the ready function in either form multiple times on the page, the browser is going to execute all of those anonymous functions that you've defined in the order that you define them once the DOM loads. So if I have this invocation and then I have more scripting code down here that uses the ready function multiple times, it's going to execute this one first, the next one second, the next one third, and so forth. And then also, using either of the types of the ready methods, you can execute as many lines of code in the anonymous function as you wish, not just the single line of code that I have here. So this function can be as complex and long as you want. Generally, you're going to want to keep the functions as simple as possible because all of this code has to execute before the page is fully alive and aware and reactive to the user. But again, that's a structural and personal preference kind of a decision that you need to make.